historically, even through remaps, we haven't had many boundary changes. We're compact, we're contiguous, we have been for decades. We largely focus on the Rogers Park neighborhood. We include parts of Westridge. There's been some changes from remap to remap sometimes on how Loyola's presence plays in the ward. We didn't have a lot of population change. So we had about a 3% increase in population. And so we don't have to change much, but there are other parts of the city that saw wilder swings in population changes, and that's where a lot of the conflict is.
And will voters actually be, at some point, will they have access to those and then vote, or is it still with the city council? And then depending on what comes out of this week's hearings or later on in the month, then there'll be next steps.
So since that, I'll say kind of initial failure to make the December 1st deadline, it's been a ton of meetings. A lot of the kind of animosity we saw earlier in December between the Black and Latino caucuses, particularly, has calmed down. And then, of course, there's been a really robust kind of parallel process, right, through this People's Map process that a lot of residents have worked on. And this is where we get this third map. This is my least favorite type of process. It's one where supposedly there was a deadline, December 1st, but then there were no real consequences of that deadline, right? And so now if council doesn't reach 41 votes, or if, let's say, we push for a vote on something and we can get more than 26, but have fewer than 41, that means that any 10 alder people who support a different map could file for a referendum. So the Latino caucus has already filed for a referendum on their map, but it could change, right? So it's, if the rest of council moves and votes on something, as long as it has fewer than 41 votes, we could be seeing a referendum in June during our primary, but we'll basically know about 40 days out from there.
Perfect. So we will just direct viewers to your Twitter page and make sure that they're, stay tuned for some new map updates. We will be holding our breath. So another piece is that Chicago has a considerable amount of the American Rescue Act funds at its disposal. Mayor Lightfoot has proposed using half of those funds in paying down the debt. We know that you and a few other aldermen co-sponsored an ordinance called the Chicago Rescue Plan, which aimed to spend that money on a wide variety of social services. While the 2022 budget did not include all of the funding you requested, I know you were pretty successful in getting, a fair amount, what you were asking for, and you did end up supporting the mayor's budget. What do you think were some of the key components that helped you decide to support that budget?
So one, I'm going to challenge a framing, because this is one of the reasons I ran for alderperson. Everyone always thinks of it as the mayor's budget. We always end up in a final debate on a vote of, did you support the mayor's budget or not? To be fair, it's still like 90%. That's really how it is, right? Like the mayor and her team put forth a budget. Most people historically, prior to this administration, and there's always been a few outliers, right? Most of them live in the Progressive Caucus, but the mayor put forth a budget. Maybe I've got a couple little things I want to see different, or some things that I want specifically focused on for my ward. And then, I'll just vote for whatever they do. I'll say that, especially over these last two budgets, but I think, as you mentioned with the Chicago Rescue Plan, you're seeing some of us who are trying to fill out that legislative role a bit more, really be more vocal and pushing for our own budgets or changes to those budgets. And so I think the budget that we voted on, I think it's really fair to think of it as not just the budget that the mayor put forth, but one that like a dozen or so of our colleagues really had a pretty firm stamp on as well. And that's one of the reasons I voted for it. I think one of our biggest wins, if we think of it from that sense, from our Progressive Caucus, was seeing so much of the Chicago Rescue Plan actually in the mayor's budget, like when she introduced it. That kind of alignment, I think, has been rare in our couple of years together, but was really, I think it spoke both well of our caucus, but also of the mayor and her team, and showing that we seem to be aligned and listening to what our constituents were saying that they needed.
Awesome. So the next topic we wanted to look at was a little bit about police reform and crime. Nationally, there's been an uptick in crime, and Chicago is no exception. We know that there have been many debates about the role of policing and what, if anything, should be done to reform the police. We would like to hear from you what you think some of the unique challenges you believe that Chicago and even your ward is facing with regards to the relationship with policing.
Sure. This is one of the issues where I frequently tell people, I wish I could just skip 20 years into the future to see what we figured out and to get some perspective, because it's.
And then you could propose that at city council, right? You'd save the day.
Right. I just rewatched the Terminator movie series, and that's the kind of time loop that I would like to support. Like, yes. So in the 49th ward, people want public safety. They want the police we have to be able to do their job. They want to see, solve rates go up on homicides. They want to see less gun violence. They want to feel safe, and they want their kids to feel safe, right? And the gun violence piece is a huge part of that, right? Like this sense of not knowing, who has weapons, like, will there be a random shooting here? And though, we saw a little peak in 2020 in our 49th ward, shootings have gone down, which is great. It's a pervasive fear, right, around the city. We also have a lot of residents, right, with family members or who themselves have been part of a criminal justice system that feels really unjust, right? So whether it's, charges that have been trumped up or, what we see as maybe crimes of poverty, people getting caught up in a criminal justice system that does more damage than good. So it adds to a lot of complexity. And then, of course, on the policing piece, I think of our history with our police department, a lot of very similar to our history with our politicians. Of course, they're good older people. They're good elected officials in Chicago and Illinois. And I know that there are also good police officers, right? And also we end up with systemic and cultural things within these institutions that either promote, violence or racism or unethical behavior or even criminal behavior. We have to come to terms with that. And there have been so many good policy changes, really excited about the, Empowered Communities for Public Safety Ordinance and the civilian oversight we're going to have. But it does put us in a really fraught place. Add on the pandemic, and we've got a public workforce, including our police officers, that are exhausted, where morale is low. And so we've got a lot of stresses on our public institutions, and it's so much change at one time. I know some people push back because it's so much change at one time, but I think we need to push through because we'll just be better for it on the other side.
Yeah, I mean, so you mentioned kind of wanting to go 20 years in the future to figure out how we kind of solve this problem. I feel the same exact way with COVID. Especially with the Omicron variant. I would like to go 20 years in the future and just hope that it's kind of resolved itself. But here we find ourselves with a new variant and an extremely infectious variant that's kind of upending life. It feels like deja vu, like 2020 all over again. So as you know, of course, Chicago just implemented a new policy, a new ordinance that pretty much says that if you want to go to many public places, you have to show proof of vaccination. So do you think that this would be an effective policy? And then looking back at that whole life cycle of the pandemic, what is your assessment of Mayor Lightfoot's leadership and decisions, as well as those decisions made in city council? So what things do you think you may have done differently or others in city council should have done differently?
For the first piece, I think the vaccine mandate is the right policy to have an effect. From a lot of our small businesses, this is what government's for. Like, government's for looking at information, deciding what's in the best of the public interest, and trying to give people some consistent baseline of like, this is the guidance or the rule or the law. Having individual businesses, and we have a lot of like locally owned small businesses here in the 49th ward, having to interpret CDPH guidance, come up with their own policies, and then try to work consistently to enforce those. I know it's been very difficult for them. And so even with not everyone being supportive of this policy, it's the right policy for now. Now residents who don't like it can be mad at the government instead of being mad at the business owner. And that's always, we're happy to be that shield. Retrospectively looking at our almost 2 years, I don't think it would be fair of me to not be generous in judgment and evaluation of Mayor Lightfoot or Dr. Arwady. Overall, especially towards the beginning, I would have liked to have seen us make more aggressive decisions to lock down on safety a little more. I think there's been a general hesitancy, we kind of lagged on shutdowns, on mask mandates, and things of that sort. They're honestly working to make the best decisions that they think with the information that they have. And I'll put that in the 2020 category. Through 2021, I would judge us pretty harshly on how we did vaccine and testing. We were coordinating our own testing and vaccination sites. We were having to set up our own things, talking to vaccine providers, hunting down lobbyists from, pharmacies to figure out if they had access to vaccines, just to try and set things up in our communities.
So to clarify, you're saying that
the
aldermen had to do that
the aldermen,
their own wards and neighborhoods.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, I felt like that was totally inappropriate. I've got a fantastic team, and we have a wonderful environment of ecology of volunteers. So 49th Ward people stepped up. We've got folks, I know, all over the city. That's what people did. All over the city, people stepped up because it was a problem that was bigger than, we had capacity to do in government and to move quickly. I'm glad to have seen that, but not every community has the resources. I have people around me who are really good at thinking through even the logistics of your setup, where your chair is going to go, how's your flow. My wife is really good at that. I'm really lucky to have her, right? Not everybody has that. So when we think about how we should be more equitably focused and how we're looking at trying to provide consistent and equitable opportunities and access, the city's focus on what they determined to be the neighborhoods of greatest concern, I think was appropriate. And also, we needed a baseline of what everyone would get. And then extra resources should have gone there. Instead, we were left on our own almost completely. Just on the COVID front, we're 2 years in. We could be doing things differently. I think some of the things that I really strongly agree with that we're hearing from CEO Martinez and the mayor are that our schools are so important, that they are the best place for our kids to be, and that we should be doing everything in our power to make sure that they are open, that our kids can go there. What I don't see CPS doing is everything in their power to make that happen. I feel like there's no contingency plans. I was in a briefing 2021, a briefing before the return to school in the fall. And I remember one of their public health officials showing us this plan on kind of how they were going to go back and looking at metrics. And I was like, well, what happens if we cross these thresholds, and what's the reverse plan? And they're like, well, there is no reverse plan. We're not going to need that. And I've heard that multiple times from CPS and from our city's administration of we're not going back. So I've got some real challenges with that thinking of, it seems like we're not dealing with reality, or we're dealing with a different set of facts and information that maybe we're not on the same page, and we really owe it to CPS families and students to get on the same page.
Got it. Thank you so much for letting us know what was happening behind the scenes. And, we appreciate so much all of the work that all of the older people have put in terms of, getting vaccines and getting testing and all of that. So thank you. So turning pretty micro level, looking directly at your ward and development projects. So Rogers Park has seen an increase in homeless populations, especially at the Toohey Park encampment. You recently launched an accelerated housing event as a way to find permanent housing. I think a lot of constituents in your ward would love to hear a little bit more about that and maybe some updates.
Sure. So I'll say some of the positives that have come out of the pandemic, right, and changes that we've seen in